Hello everyone. So today I want to show you how to create this kind of dusty planet that you see here. This is building off a tutorial that I made on the KTT for Houdini YouTube channel where we created the surface texture for this planet. That is not required viewing. I've linked the textures in the pinned comment and you can download them for free to follow along. But I'd also recommend watching episodes 1 through 3 of my Blender 4.3 Planet course. Um, those cover a lot of the setups that we're using here. This video is more kind of about aggregating those techniques and applying them to this planet render that you see here. So with that being said, that's kind of like this, that makes it more of like an intermediate to advanced type of tutorial. So if you aren't already fairly well versed in Blender, this might be a little bit tricky to follow along. But yeah, thank you guys very much for watching, and let's get to it. All right, so we'll start off with the ground because that's a pretty accessible place to start. Just a reminder, we did create the ground in the last video, which was posted on the KTT for Houdini channel. The link will be on the top right of the screen right now. You should see it. If you don't want to follow that video though, and I perfectly understand why, either you don't have Houdini or you don't have KTT or both, um, don't worry. The texture files are linked in the pinned comment below, so you can just download those and you should be good to go. Anyways, let's get started. So I have a very basic material set up here. I think it's kind of worth discussing more like kind of the actual displacement bit of this because uh, really, I'm not doing anything fancy here. The only thing that I'm doing is kind of like this slightly weird um, HSV adjustment to make it a little bit like more clear. If I turn this off and just plug the base color in, like it's just kind of dull. So I'm just color ramping the saturation and increasing the value a little bit. And that just brings up the clarity in the surface and it accentuates the vibrance of the like sand dunes right here. But that's really all I'm doing for the coloring. So the displacement, I'm using adaptive subdivision. So that was moved out of experimental in either 4.5 or 5.0. I think it's 5.0. Anyways, now it's a lot better than it was a couple years back. It's a lot more performant. I think it uses less memory. I'm not sure on that. It might be about the same. But I have a fairly conservative setup here. You'll notice I have the render dicing rate set at 2 pixels on the viewport at 8. The reason is I render at pretty high resolution. This is just native 4K. Uh, and you can change the subdivision properties in this subdivision tab right here. So I have the dicing rate render set to 2 and the viewport at 8. Um, you don't usually need like 1 pixel dicing scale. Usually you're not going to notice like the kind of blocky artifacts from the displacement at that point. Even at like 8 right here, it looks mostly fine, which is interesting. So make sure to save some memory where you can. Uh, yeah, it's not worth crowding your scene up with a ton of geometry if you already have pretty high res textures that are also eating up a lot of memory. Anyways, also make sure you've applied the scale on your ground mesh. So right here, I'm using kind of the dimensions that I used for my planet course, which is 6,000 meter radius spheres for the ground and the atmosphere. So I just applied the scale on this ground mesh. The reason why this doesn't work necessarily, or why having weird scales doesn't work, is just because for some reason, like the strength of the bump doesn't get recalibrated properly when you're using the displacement and bump node of the for the displacement, which is what you want to use, by the way. Just displacement only will not work well with your normals if you're using any dicing rate above 2. So getting an additional bit of free normal detail in there is quite handy. So Displacement and bump all the way makes a huge difference, but just make sure you apply the scale. I think that's probably about it for the displacement. These are the settings I'm using for the actual node. If I increase this, you can see it makes it a little bit stronger, but that's a lot. Um, just change this to what you feel looks good. I think 10 works pretty well for this scene. Gets the mountains to kind of just poke through the atmosphere a little bit, but it's not like they're not going completely through it, which is nice. So they're just kind of like big, chunky mountains. Okay, so let's talk about mapping real quick. So you'll see I'm using this normalize right here, or I'm using this setup right here. So this texture coordinate, normalize, and then mapping. Um, when I exit camera view, you can see me pull back the curtain a little bit. It's just this one texture that's just tile mapped over the entire uh, planet, and it's extremely ugly over here. But you know what? We don't need a sea over here, so that does not matter whatsoever. So make sure you, yeah, so just kind of play with these settings until you have something you like. The normalize here is really helpful for a couple of reasons. For one, it just kind of makes the sliders here a little bit more intuitive. Normalize, if I just show this, if I go to this object thing, you can see it's absolutely going crazy. That's because these values are like massive that it outputs because it's such a big object. And normalize will kind of crush those down into something that makes a little bit more sense. As you can see here, that's kind of what you expect from a like I don't know what you'd say, UV sphere vector coordinates thing. Um, and then the mapping, yeah. I hope you guys know sort of how to play with that. Yeah. Anyways, um, yeah. So just find some composition that you like. Uh, in this case, yeah, I'm just using these settings, and then my camera is actually really weird. If you'll notice down here, I'm like it's like upside down. So like this is kind of the right side up. I was just playing around with the camera location, and I was figured that this was pretty interesting for a composition, so I set it like that. Yeah, nothing too crazy, but yeah, just mess around with the scale, the rotation, location, what have you, until you find something that you like. Alrighty. I think that's about it for the ground. Let's move on to the atmosphere. This is where I'm going to kind of draw on some of the concepts and knowledge from the 4.3 planet course because it's very much using the same things. In fact, I didn't quite append this over to this blend file, but like I often just append the node setups that I make and like the atmosphere objects all over the place, just because they're really handy to have. If you followed the first episode in the course, you'll recognize a lot of this. And it's literally just the exact same setup with just a bit of a different color for the atmosphere. It's like kind of this tan, like pale tan color. A lot of the sort of richness of that like orange yellow is coming through the color, or what am I saying? The color management stuff. I have Pixel Manager, which is a OCIO library or whatever, that that gives me a lot more control over the specific look of the color management in the scene. But if you did something like in AGX and just kind of tuned the values, if I just do like very high contrast, obviously this is a little bit like bluer, but like you can totally tune the values here until you have something that you like. Um, Really, just like you don't have to follow me exactly to get pretty good results. I do things in kind of a weird way um, that you shouldn't necessarily always replicate. I'm kind of going through this just to show you kind of how hacky some of my little techniques are. But if you want to just sort of screenshot these nodes and do what you want with them, feel free to. Um, I believe this was covered in the planet course, but if you'll notice the um, border of the uh, atmosphere is it's got these kind of like almost rings. That's because the atmosphere has in real life has a lot of layers. So what you can do is you can kind of insert a little bit of noise um, into the uh, sort of height or altitude calculation, and this gives the atmosphere a little bit of that layered effect. So, and you can change it as you want. So just figure out some settings for that look good for you. Um, you want it to be a little bit subtle, but you don't. Yeah, you want it to be there because if it's just smooth, um, it's a little bit weird to look at. In this case, I think it's a little bit stronger than it needs to be, but I like it. Um, it's really just that extra little attention to detail that makes things look good and realistic. Um, I mean, it'd still be a fine render without it, but it's better with it in because I mean, it's also just kind of my style of doing planets and stuff. So if you see like intense layering on planet atmospheres, it's probably me that's doing it. But yeah, so nothing too crazy there. Make sure you've got your displacement here again set to displacement and bump, and very low step rate for the volume, and also in the volumes tab, make sure you're using biased and that you have a low max steps. I use 16. This will keep performance manageable and it'll still look perfectly fine. So that's it for the atmosphere. Let's go on to the clouds and the sandstorms. And these are kind of two different types of the same thing. So if I'm going to enable this cirrus cloud layer, and I'm not going to cover specifically what all of these nodes do in this node group. This is directly appended from the blend files in the planet course. So if you pay attention to, or yeah, this is covered, I believe, in episode 3 of the course, which is all about shading these clouds and getting this object set up. So I don't want to rehash that because it's a little bit redundant and it's explained better there anyways. But this cloud, right, this cloud texture right here, this is a wispy like cirrus cloud composite that I grabbed from satellite data. And I showed the process for that, by the way, in episode 2 of the planet course. So if you want to go back and watch that, you can. That explains pretty much the entire process that I used to create these. And you'll notice it's again map tiled around the planet. So I just crafted a composition that I like. Honestly, just like kind of rotating it until I got like some neat shapes that were visible on the in the render, which is pretty nice. And then I fed the this value output into this cloud shader that I have. You don't need to. You can just, I believe, use the this vector output, or sorry, not the vector, volume output right here, which I covered in the planet course again. Sorry, I know I'm just like saying, you go watch my planet course. But really, it's yeah, it's good viewing for this because otherwise it would take way too long for me to explain everything that's going on here. And this is literally directly pulled from it. So if you understand what's going on there, you'll understand what's going on here. Main takeaways from this is just kind of like get some cool cloud maps, put them together, and fit them to your scene in a way that you like. Doesn't have to be too complicated. So I'm gonna turn this off and I'm going to enable the sandstorms right here. Now, this is an interesting effect. This is a very subtle effect. And by the way, exact same shader setup here, pretty much. I added in this color ramp to kind of control it, but I ended up not using it, so that's actually like entirely useless. Yeah, same exact setup here. The only difference is that if you'll notice right here, is that these are lower down, so they're cloud. So this is, by the way, I'm looking at the cirrus object. Um, the height of these is 3 meters off the ground. The height of these is 10. So these cirrus clouds are layered kind of on top. They're layered on top of the sandstorms. This is kind of a bad angle to view it from. But yeah, so you can see like these dust storms or sandstorms. They're just hovering above the ground. Then on top of them, or much higher up, is the cirrus clouds. I'm going to turn that off. And then also, they're a lot thicker. So this thickness here is 4, and then the thickness here is just 1. The reason being is the thicker that you make the clouds, the more kind of fuzzy they'll look. And if I just increase this to 25, I guess, you can see very clearly how they're a lot more fuzzy. The cirrus clouds should be fairly sharp and fairly light in terms of like density. They just kind of need to provide that little white coverage right there, and not have too many. Yeah, they shouldn't look too fuzzy. So keeping them very thin but rather high altitude and very bright is works well for them. And then for these sandstorms, you want them quite low, quite a little bit fuzzier, not super fuzzy, but a little bit fuzzier, and dark. So in this case, I'm using kind of an adjustment of that same cloud shader, this time with just this gray value, and then also a bit of absorption. If you want to recreate this from scratch, it's like really, really easy. You just need volume, oops, caps lock, volume scatter, or actually just a principled volume will work. Principled volume, and just plug this into density, and then plug this into the volume, and then you can change the sort of look of these clouds right here. Make sure you get something that's kind of matching the average color of everything. So in this case, let me move this back to this shader right here. So it's not quite as saturated as these dunes, but clearly some of that sand is going to get picked up and loaded into here. So it's a little bit like it's kind of this reddish brown color. It's not completely desaturated. So it's kind of a mix between the two of them. And this wouldn't look very good if it was just completely desaturated. It'd look kind of like, I don't know, smoke or something, which doesn't really make sense because nothing's burning. But if I make this too saturated and too close to the dunes color, it's going to look pretty weird as well, because like the dunes are just a small part of the surface, and most of that stuff that's going to be kicked up is just dust, right? So it's all about finding that balance right there, trying to pretend like the stuff has been mixed up and it's kind of just the average of a couple different colors. All right, folks, so that's actually all there is to it. I know I've kind of made you guys jump around to a couple different videos to explain certain things. I do apologize for that. But unfortunately, there's just no brief, efficient way to explain every single little minute thing in this video, especially when there's already other videos that cover it. But I do recognize it takes a little bit more work. And if you got to this point, I applaud you for that. Anyways, I hope you can see kind of the utility of the workflow that I had outlined in the Planet Course videos. They're Yeah, it's a very powerful workflow that I use for pretty much most of my space renders that involve planets. In this video, we of course explored a little bit about how to integrate a ground texture to your planets. Um, but yeah. Anyways, I won't hold you guys for too long. Thank you very much for watching. Join our Discord, a link in the description below. If you're curious as to how we made the um, ground texture, you can find the link to that video on the end screen. And yeah, thank you guys very much for watching. I'll see you guys later. Bye.